Section 2. Vows and Volunteers. We have sometimes been asked why we do not admire advertisers quite so much as they admire themselves. One answer is that it is of their very nature to admire themselves. And it is of the very nature of our task that people must be taught to criticize themselves, or rather, preferably, to kick themselves. They talk about truth in advertising, but there cannot be any such thing in the sharp sense in which we need truth in politics. It is impossible to put in the cheery terms of publicity either the truth about how bad things are, or the truth about how hard it will be to cure them. No advertiser is so truthful as to say, "Do your best with our rotten old typewriter, we can't get anything better just now." But we have really got to say, "Do your best with your rotten old machine of production, don't let it fall to pieces too suddenly." We seldomly see a gay and conspicuous hoarding inscribed, "You are in for a rough time if you use our new kitchen range." But we have really got to say to our friends, "You are in for a rough time if you start new farms on your own, but it is the right thing." We cannot pretend to be offering merely comforts and conveniences. Whatever our ultimate view of labor-saving machinery, we cannot offer our ideal as a labor-saving machine. There is no more question of comfort than there is for a man in a fire, a battle, or a shipwreck. There is no way out of the danger, except the dangerous way. The sort of call that must be made on the modern English is the sort of call that is made before a great war or a great revolution. If the trumpet give an uncertain sound, but it must be unmistakably the sound of a trumpet. The megaphone of mere mercantile self-satisfaction is merely loud, and not in the least clear. In its nature it is saying smooth things, even if it is roaring them. It is like one whispering soft nothings, even if its whisper is a horrible yell. How can advertisements bid men prepare themselves for a battle? How can publicity talk in the language of public spirit? It cannot say, "Buy land at Blinkington-on-Sea and prepare yourself for the battle with stones and thistles." It cannot give a certain sound, like the old tocsin that rang for fire and flood, and tell the people of Puddleton that they are in danger of famine. To do men justice, no man did announce the needs of Kitchener's army like the comforts of the kitchen range. We did not say to the recruits, "Spend your holidays at Mons." We did not say, "Try our trenches, they are a treat." We made some sort of attempt to appeal to better things. We have to make that appeal again, and in the face of worse things. It is this that is made so difficult by the whole tone of advertisement. For the next thing we have to consider is the need of independent individual action on a large scale. We want to make the need known, as the need for recruits was made known. Education was too commercial in origin, and has allowed itself to be largely swamped by commercial advertisement. It came too much from the town, and now it is nearly driven from the town. Education really meant the teaching of town things to country people who did not want to learn them. I suggest that education should now mean the teaching of country things to town people who do want to learn them. I quite admit it would be much better to begin at least with those who really want it. But I also maintain that there are really a great many people in town and country who do really want it. Whether we look forward to an agrarian law or no, whether our notion of distribution is rigid or rough and ready, whether we believe in compensation or confiscation, whether we look for this law or that law, we ought not to sit down and wait for any law at all. While the grass grows, the steed has got to show that he wants grass. The steed has got to explain that he really is a graminivorous quadruped. The fulfilment of parliamentary promises grows rather slower than grass, and if nothing is done before the completion of what is called a constitutional process, we shall be about as near to distributism as a Labour politician is to socialism. It seems to me first necessary to revive the medieval or moral method and call for volunteers. The English could do what the Irish did. They could make laws by obeying them. If we are, like the original Sinn Féiners, to anticipate legal change by social agreement, we want two sorts of volunteers in order to make the experiment on the spot. We want to find out how many peasants there are, actual or potential, who would take over the responsibility of small farms for the sake of self-sufficiency, of real property, and of saving England in a desperate hour. We want to know how many landlords there are who would now give or sell cheaply their land to be cut up into a number of such farms. Honestly, I think the landlord would have the best of the bargain. Or rather, I think the peasant would have the hardest and most heroic part of the bargain. Sometimes it would practically pay the landlord to chuck the land altogether, since he is paying out to something that does not pay him back. But in any case, everybody has got to realize that the situation is, in no cant phrases, one for heroic remedies. It is impossible to disguise that the man who gets the land, even more than the man who gives up the land, will have to be something of a hero. We shall be told that heroes do not grow on every hedgerow, and that we cannot find enough to defend all our hedges. We raised 3 million heroes with the blast of a bugle but a few years ago, and the trumpet we hear today is in a more terrible sense the trump of doom. We want a popular appeal for volunteers to save the land, exactly as volunteers in 1914 were wanted to save the country. But we do not want the appeal weakened by that weak-minded, that wearisome, that dismal and deplorable thing that the newspapers call optimism. We are not asking babies to look pleasant while their photographs are taken. We are asking grown men to meet a crisis as grave as a great war. We are not asking people to cut a coupon out of a newspaper, but to carve a farm out of a trackless waste. And if it is to be successful, it must be faced in something of the stubborn spirit of the old fulfillment of a vow. St. Francis showed his followers the way to a greater happiness, but he did not tell them that a wandering and homeless life would mean everything as nice as Mother makes it, nor did he advertise it on hoardings as a home from home. But we live in a time when it is harder for a free man to make a home than it was for a medieval ascetic to do without one. The quarrel about the Limehouse slums was a working model of the problem, if we can talk of a working model of something that does not work, and something on which only a madman would model anything. The slum dwellers actually and definitely say that they prefer their slums to the blocks of flats provided as a refuge from the slums. And they prefer them, it is stated, because the old homes had backyards in which they could pursue their hobbies of bird fancying and poultry rearing. When offered other opportunities on some scheme of allotment, they had the hideous depravity to say that they liked fences round their private yards. So awful and overwhelming is the red torrent of communism as it boils through the brains of the working classes. Now, of course, it might conceivably be necessary in some wild congestion and convulsion for people's houses to be piled on top of each other forever, in the form of a tower of flats. And so it might be necessary for men to climb on other men's shoulders in a flood, or to get out of a chasm cloven by an earthquake. And it is logically conceivable, and even mathematically correct, that we might thin the crowds in the London streets if we could thus arrange men vertically instead of horizontally. If there were only some expedient by which a man might walk about with another man standing above him, and another above that, and so on, it would save a great deal of jostling. Men are arranged like that in acrobatic performances, and a course of such acrobatics might be made compulsory in all the schools. It is a picture that pleases me very much, as a picture. I look forward, in the spirit of art for art's sake, to seeing such a living tower moving majestically down the Strand. I like to think of the time of true social organization, when all the clerks of Messrs. Boodle and Bunkum shall no longer come up in their present random and straggling fashion, each from his little suburban villa. They shall not even, as in the immediate and intermediary stage of the servile state, march in a well-drilled column from the dormitory in one part of London to the emporium in the other. No, a nobler vision has arisen before me into the very heights of heaven. A toppling pagoda of clerks, one balanced on top of another, moves down the street, perhaps making acrobatic patterns in the air as it moves, to illustrate the perfect discipline of its social machinery. All that would be very impressive, and it really would, among other things, economize space. But if one of the men near the top of that swaying tower were to say that he hoped some day to be able to revisit the earth, I should sympathize with his sense of exile. If he were to say that it is natural to man to walk on the earth, I should find myself in agreement with his school of philosophy. If he were to say that it was very difficult to look after chickens in that acrobatic altitude and attitude, I should think his difficulty a real one. At first it might be retorted that bird fancying would be even more appropriate to such an airy perch, but in practice those birds would be very fancy birds. Finally, if he said that keeping chickens that laid eggs was worthy and valuable social work, much more worthy and valuable than serving Messrs. Boodle and Bunkum with the most perfect discipline and organization, I should agree with that sentiment most of all. Now, the whole of our modern problem is very difficult, and though in one way the agricultural part of it is much the simplest, in another way it is by no means the least difficult. But this Limehouse affair is a vivid example of how we make the difficulty more difficult. We are told again and again that the slum dwellers of the big towns cannot merely be turned loose on the land, that they do not want to go on the land, that they have no tastes or turns of thought that could make them by any process into a people interested in the land, that they cannot be conceived as having any pleasures except town pleasures, or even any discontents except the Bolshevism of the towns. And then, when a whole crowd of them want to keep chickens, we force them to live in flats. When a whole crowd of them want to have fences, we laugh and order them off into communal barracks. When a whole population wishes to insist on palings and enclosures and the traditions of private property, the authorities act as if they were suppressing a red riot. When these very hopeless slum dwellers do actually set their hopes on a rural occupation, which they can still practice even in the slums, we tear them away from that occupation and call it improving their condition. You pick a man up who has his head in a hen coop, forcibly set him on giant stilts, 100 feet high, where he cannot reach the ground, and then say you have saved him from misery. And you add that a man like that can only live on stilts, and would never be interested in hens. Now the very first question that is always asked of those advocating our sort of agricultural reconstruction is this question, which is fundamental because it is psychological. Whatever else we may or may not need for peasantry, we do certainly need peasants. In the present mixture and muddle of more or less urbanized civilization, have we even the first elements, or the first possibilities? Have we peasants, or even potential peasants? Like all questions of this sort, it cannot be answered by statistics. Statistics are artificial even when they are not fictitious, for they always assume the very fact which a moral estimate must always deny. They assume that every man is one man. They are based on a sort of atomic theory that the individual is really individual, in the sense of indivisible. But when we are dealing professedly with the proportion of different loves, or hates, or hopes, or hungers, this is so far from being a fact that can be assumed, it is the very first that must be denied. It is denied by all that deeper consideration which wise men used to call spiritual, but which fools were frightened out of calling spiritual, till they ventured to say it in Greek, and called it psychical, or psychological. In one sense, the highest spirituality insists, of course, that one man is one. But in the sense here involved, the spiritual view has always been that one man was at least two, and the psychological view has shown some taste for turning him into half a dozen. It is no good, therefore, to discuss the number of peasants who are nothing else but peasants. Very probably there are none at all. It is no good asking how many complete and compact yeomen or yokels are waiting all ready in smock frocks or blouses, their spades and hay forks clutched in their hand, in the neighbourhood of Brompton or Brixton, waiting for us to give the signal to rush back to the land. If anybody is such a fool as to expect that sort of thing, the fool is not to be found in our small political party. When we are dealing with a matter of this kind, we are dealing with different elements in the same class, or even in the same man. We are dealing with elements which should be encouraged, or educated, or, if we must bring the word in somewhere, evolved. We have to consider whether there are any materials out of which to make peasants, to make a peasantry, if we really choose to try. Nowhere in these notes have I suggested that there is the faintest possibility of it being done if we do not choose to try. Now, using words in this sensible sense, I should maintain that there is a very large element still in England that would like to return to this simpler sort of England. Some of them understand it better than others. Some of them understand it themselves better than others. Some would be prepared for it as a revolution. Some only cling to it very blindly as a tradition. Some have never thought of it as anything but a hobby. Some have never heard of it and feel it only as a want. But the number of people who would like to get out of the tangle of mere ramifications and communications in the town, and get back nearer to the roots of things, where things are made directly out of nature, I believe to be very large. It is probably not a majority, but I suspect that even now it is a very large minority. A man does not necessarily want this more than everything else at every moment of his life. No sane person expects any movement to consist entirely of such monomaniacs, but a good many people want it a good deal. I have formed that impression from experience, which is of all things the most difficult to reproduce in controversy. I guess it from the way in which numberless suburbans talk about their gardens. I guess it from the sort of things that they really envy in the rich, one of the most notable of which is merely empty space. I notice it in all the element that desires the country, even if it defaces the country. I notice it in the profound popular interest everywhere, especially in England, in the breeding or training of any kind of animal. And if I wanted a supreme, a symbolic, a triumphant example of all that I mean, I could find it in the case I have quoted of these men living in the most miserable slums of Limehouse, and reluctant to leave them because it would mean leaving behind a rabbit in a rabbit hutch, or a chicken in a hen coop. Now, if we were really doing what I suggest, or if we really knew what we were doing, we should seize on those slum dwellers as if they were infant prodigies, or, even more lucrative, monsters to be exhibited in a fair. We should see that such people have a natural genius for such things. We should encourage them in such things. We should educate them in such things. We should see in them the seed and living principle of a real spontaneous revival of the countryside. I repeat that it would be a matter of proportion and therefore of tact. But we should be on their side, being confident that they are on our side and on the side of the countryside. We should reconstruct our popular education so as to help these hobbies. We should think it worthwhile to teach people the things they are so eager to teach themselves. We should teach them. We might even, in a burst of Christian humility, occasionally allow them to teach us. What we do is bundle them out of their houses, where they do these things with difficulty, and drag them shrieking to new and unfamiliar places, where they cannot do them at all. This example alone would show how much we are really doing for the rural reconstruction of England. Though much could be done by volunteers, and by a voluntary bargain between the men who really could do the work and the men who frequently cannot get the rent, there is nothing in our social philosophy that forbids the use of the state power where it can be used. And either by a state subsidy or some large voluntary fund, it seems to me that it would still be possible at least to give the other man something as good as the rent that he does not get. In other words, long before our communists come to the controversial ethics of confiscation, it seems to me within the resources of civilization to enable Brown to buy from Smith what is now of very little value to Smith, and might be of very great value to Brown. I know the current complaint against subsidy, and the general argument that applies equally to subscription, but I do think that a subsidy to require agriculture would find more repayment in the future than a subsidy to patch up the position of coal, just as I think that, in its turn, more defensible than 100 salaries that we pay to a mob of nobodies for plaguing the poor with sham science and petty tyranny. But there are, as I have already hinted, other ways by which even the state could help in the matter. So long as we have state education, it seems a pity that it can never at any moment be determined by the needs of the state. If the immediate needs of the state is to pay some attention to the existence of the earth, there really seems no reason why the eyes of the schoolmasters and schoolboys, staring at the stars, should not be turned in the direction of that planet. At present we have education, not indeed for angels, but rather for aviators. They do not even understand a man's wish to remain tied to the ground. There is in their ideal an insanity that may be truly called unearthly. Now, I suggest such a peasantry of volunteers primarily as a nucleus, but I think it will be a nucleus of attraction. I think it will stand up not only as a rock, but as a magnet. In other words, as soon as it is admitted that it can be done, it will become important when a number of other things can no longer be done. Where trade is increasingly bad, this will be counted better, even by those who count it as second best. When we speak of people leaving the countryside and flocking to the towns, we are not judging the case fairly. Something may be allowed for a social type that would always prefer cinemas and picture postcards, even to property and liberty. But there is nothing conclusive in the fact that people prefer to go without property and liberty with a cinema to going without property and liberty without a cinema. Some people may like the town so much that they would rather be sweated in the town than free in the country. But nothing is proved by the mere fact that they would rather be sweated in the town than sweated in the country. I believe, therefore, that if we created even a considerable patch of peasantry, the patch would grow. People would fall back on it as they retired from the declining trades. At present the patch is not growing, because there is no patch to grow. People do not even believe in its existence, and can hardly believe in its extension. So far, I merely propose to suggest that many peasants would now be ready to work alone on the land, though it would be a sacrifice, that many squires would be ready to let them have the land, though it would be a sacrifice, that the state, and for that matter any other patriotic corporation, could be called upon to help either or both in these actions, that it might not be an intolerable or impossible sacrifice. In all this, I would remind the reader that I am only dealing with immediately practicable action, and not with an ultimate or complete condition. But it seems to me that something of this sort might be set about almost at once. I shall next proceed to consider a misunderstanding about how a group of peasants could live on the land.